Welcome, everyone. We have a very special guest, Nadia Boujarwah, unicorn tech founder who has raised over 120 million for Dia Co, a leading marketplace in the fashion industry focusing on plus sizes. I'm Alejandro Garcia-Amaya. I'm founder of the Techstars Alumni and AnswerBite. My co-host is my brother, Ricardo, fellow seasoned venture-backed tech founder who leads a number of powerful communities, including the YC alumni community. Anything to add to that, Richie?
No, that's it. You got it.
Okay. Nadia, our community is made up of the top 1% venture-backed tech founders in the world from Y Combinator and Techstars. Those that are able to join us, we're happy to have you guys here. Please make sure to keep your cameras on, your mute on, and update your profile so you keep your name and company showing. We'll dedicate 10 minutes at the end, 10, 15 minutes for Q&A where you can introduce yourself, ask your question. And as we cover subjects, feel free to DM Richie with questions you might have as we're covering certain topics, and we'll do our best to include it. I'm going to give a little bit of background on Nadia before we start. I know I gave a little bit, but I'm going to go a little bit deeper here in your journey. Nadia, as we know, founder and CEO of Dia Co, leading marketplace for fashion and plus sizes, which carries brands from Madewell and Third Love to Tanya Taylor and Carolina Herrera. Dia has raised over 120 million from venture capital investors like Sequoia Capital and Union Square Ventures. Dia Co has partnered with major designers and celebrities to launch dozens of limited edition collections, including Betsy Johnson, Rebel Wilson, Venus Williams, Lang Dunham, and Danielle Brooks. Prior to funding Dia Co, Nadia worked as an investment banker at Perella Weinberg Partners. I have a couple friends that were in that company. Most recently served as COO and CFO of New York-based jewelry brand Frieda and Nelly? Is that?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Not too bad. I tend to butcher a lot of names, even when I'm a foreigner and I have a long name, I still butcher other foreigner and like long names. It doesn't help. Okay. So let's start off with, for everyone that's here, Nadia, can you share what led you to create Dia Co with your Harvard Business School classmate, Lydia Gilbert?
Sure. So thrilled to be here. It's an awesome group of communities that you guys sit in the middle of, which is super exciting and always great to spend time with fellow founders. So thrilled to be here.
Thank you.
You know, I think probably like a lot of founders, my journey to founding Dia kind of goes through personal experience first and foremost. I started my career as an investment banker, so really had no intention of being a tech founder or certainly not being in retail. But I had always worn larger sizes. So ever since I was a teenager, I think shopping in much larger sizes was an experience that I knew very well. It was very formative, very traumatic, honestly, in some ways. All the way through to the time that I was a banker where, you know, in reality, I had disposable income to spend on clothing, and yet clothing above a size really 10, 12 in the US at that time was incredibly difficult to find. When Lydia and I were at business school is kind of this like wonderful place where you get to think about businesses and industries in a very open-ended way. And one of the things that was happening at the time was that this was 2011 to 2013. So this was like the earliest days of Instagram. All these women who had these web-based blogs were all of a sudden being centralized onto these platforms where you could follow them and they could have voices, and Instagram and Facebook. And one of the things that I started to observe was that there were tastemakers and style influencers in larger sizes. And this was a totally new experience, right? Because in the past, the gatekeepers of style had been a very small group of elite magazines and designers and, you know, celebrities. And all of a sudden there was this really democratization of style content that was happening on these social platforms. And what was emerging wasn't really more of the same style content. It was new style content. It was style content from women who had not previously been or historically been represented in fashion content, namely women in larger sizes. And that was super fascinating to me. And so for the first time, it kind of opened the question of, how does this industry work? Are there a lot of women who shop in larger sizes? Why is the industry not set up to support them, to serve them? And I think even now, it's 2024, so literally 13 years later, I think the plus size apparel market remains one of the most fascinating consumer markets in the world. In the US, about 7 in 10 women wear above a size 10. We estimate that there are about 100 million adult female consumers in the US alone that shop in these sizes. That those stats are basically the same across developed and developing countries around the world, in terms of the proportion, which in almost every case is the majority of consumers that are shopping in these sizes. And yet, if you look at the supply side, if you look at what the industry looks like today, it is categorically the opposite, right? The vast majority of retailers have very little in these offerings. There are, kind of large incumbent players that have always served this market in a specialty format that continue to do so, but it's much better today. But when we were looking at this question in 2013, really there was nothing. And so there's just this kind of like interesting intellectual question that I also had a very deep personal stake in, which is why? Like, how does it work that this industry remains disjointed in this way for so long? Right? Like, I was a banker, I was at Harvard Business School. Like, I'm not somebody who believed that markets were anything but efficient, to be honest. And it seemed like there was some big disconnect here, that if somebody could figure out how to do that, the amount of latent demand that could be realized in this category was very, very large.
I'm curious, how did you get started? What was the initial, so you saw this, right? So you felt the pain, right?
Yeah.
You experienced it. You researched the market. You were beginning to see this major gap. And then, like, what was that next step? What did you do?
I mean, when we were in school, we literally did a project on this. Like, it was like very, kind of studenty. But the interesting thing about this market in particular is that there's a ton of demographic data, like the rates of obesity in the US. The health data is very clear. And the retail data is very clear. And what no one seemed to be doing was connecting the demographic data with the industry data and saying, there's a gap here, right? Like, so where do all these women shop? How is it really that there's like some fundamental profile difference in terms of demand in these categories? We never believed that, because we were always looking at the problem from the perspective of the demand side, right? We were the demand. And so, kind of bringing it together, these two well understood pieces of information in a way that said, hey, there's got to be an option here. There's got to be some way to look at this category and say, with a different set of offerings, with a different scale of ambition, with a new approach, could a market be created, right? And I think like that question of saying, is there a market to create here, is kind of like really the best types of questions to answer with venture capital, because venture is about identifying large markets where something can exist in a way that it fundamentally didn't exist before.
Right.
And so when we thought about, what type of business do we want to build? How do we want to capitalize this business? What is the scale of the ambition that we have? Venture felt like the right way to progress.
And I know that, Richie, give me a sec, because I know you want to jump into partnerships. But what did you do? Did that immediately mean that you fundraise? Like when you said venture, so it was like immediately, here's our thesis, this is what we believe is missing, and this is what we can provide, and you fundraise right away?
We tried. We tried. We had one of these, like, for us, fundraising was exceptionally difficult until it wasn't. And then once it wasn't, it was exceptionally easy, right? So like we bootstrapped / fundraised for 24 months with $1 million. And then truly like in the next 18 months, we raised $100 million. Like it was, as soon as we had traction, it was just like the
You hit a
floodgates.
certain tipping point with
We
your
hit a tipping
traction.
point, and then it was like, it was also a different time, right? So this was 2014, 2015, 2016. Venture appetite for direct to consumer businesses was very different. You know, it was kind of like it was the upslope of DTC funding. And we were definitely like a benefactor of that. But yeah, I mean, we got pretty far. We were doing, you know, probably $15 million in revenue a year before we raised our Series A.
Oh,
And then,
Wow.
Yeah.
Before
It's a lot
Series
of traction
A.
even before the A.
Yeah, that is a lot.
I have a question that having to do, Nadia, you mentioned that you did investment banking. Did you do like your 2 years, or how many years in investment banking?
I did 3.
Okay, that you're 3 years. Okay. I have plenty of investment banking friends, pre and post business school. How different was your outlook, or how did it change going from investment banking when you have 1 million points of data to break down, and you know it's all where, and then to the startup worlds, which you know we are all familiar on this call.
To having to sell to somebody. Pitch. Yeah.
Or the lack of data in the first 18 months and making decisions with very little data. How did that and I'm leading, that's a leading question, but anything else along the lines, any differences from your background and
Yeah, investment banking.
I mean, I think that we were business founders, right? Like we weren't engineering founders, we weren't even like product founders, we weren't design founders, we were business founders. And so I think that like the background from investment banking meant that we were always a business that talked about like why this was a good business. And you know, had a perspective on like what the business needed to be able to do, prove, be. That meant that, you know, I do have a technical co-founder who joined us very early, and we obviously have to build the rest of the team, but I think that the background just meant that that was the lens through which we looked at our business. And, you know, for every founder, it's different, right? Like every organization has a different personality and a different set of primary lenses that they look through. And, you know, for us, that was a very business oriented lens, I would say.
Nadia, how did you get started? Because you talked about the first 2 years bootstrapping and raising $1 million. How did you attract your initial customer base? Can you walk us through like what were some of the first initial things that you did?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like these tactics are very era specific because the world looked very different in 2013, 2014. In 2013, 2014, we could reach out to influencers and they would do whatever we wanted them because they were excited about what we were building. And it was like not commercial at all. So we literally started by having an influencer put out a survey that had something like 3,000 respondents, and the prize for the survey was like $100 Amazon gift card. Like it was like nothing. But a very different time on the internet. I know it's not that long ago, but really people behaved very differently. Everyone in that survey gave us contact information, which is kind of crazy. And so we started individually contacting those 3,000 women. We didn't really, like, we had an idea. We had a customer that we wanted to serve and we had a market that we wanted to change, but we didn't really have any pre-existing notions about what the business model needed to be. And so we kind of just like reverse engineered for a long time from talking to a lot of women to figure out like what made the most sense. And those first 3,000 women, who some of them are still our customers, were very, very impactful in helping us understand like exactly where's the friction here. Like, is it that there isn't enough product? Is it that the product is hard to find? Is it that the shopping experience is bad? Is it that there's designers that aren't serving? Like, what if we had to force rank, what are the things that seem to be creating the most friction equation. What are those and what are potential solutions to those frictions? And honestly, like our business has evolved and pivoted pretty meaningfully in the course of the last 10 years because those frictions have changed. And so, you know, today there are many, many, many more brands that offer plus. And so our business in the last 5 years pivoted into a marketplace versus like a direct to consumer, you know, kind of platform. So we've always reverse engineered from the problem because in our mind, the interesting thing here or the thing that's like worth spending time on is the problem itself, not necessarily the specific business solution that we're proposing for the problem.
When did that pivot take, the marketplace one from the direct to consumer like to marketplace? When did that happen? And I'm guessing based on, and how do you maintain that sense, those relationships with those initial, you know, that community, the initial customers?
Yeah, I mean, as much as we didn't have, you know, kind of a horse in the race proverbially of what type of business we wanted to build, there's some business models that are just have meaningful advantages if that happens to be a business model that works in your category. And so like marketplaces are a business model where if you can get a marketplace to work in a category, I personally think that that is a far superior business model than a traditional retailing model, right? Like there are elements of defensibility and growth loops and other things that you can have in a marketplace that just can be very hard to replicate in other business models. If we could have created a bit of marketplace from the beginning, we would have done that. But marketplaces are only as good as the supply that they can accumulate. And in 2020, you know, in 2014, there wasn't any supply, but that was the original problem. And so it wouldn't have made sense to try to create a marketplace. We would have had a marketplace with the same 3 brands that she was already shopping in. And that's just like,
right.
And there's not value, but you fast forward to 2019 and all of a sudden every brand in the world had larger sizes, right? Because inclusivity became much more important. You know, in our world, there was a huge movement around body positivity. By 2020, that accelerated even further and everybody was much more focused on inclusivity across a variety of dimensions, size being one of them. And all of a sudden you had all these like small subscale assortments of larger sizes across thousands of brands. And that became very interesting because now we can have, we're kind of unique in that we go from like very mainstream price points all the way up to luxury. But, you know, some of our luxury designers have 8 or 10 styles in larger sizes. That's not an assortment that it makes sense to have on a standalone basis, right? It's very hard for a customer to go to a brand's site and shop 8 to 10 styles. Like that's just not a successful experience. But if those 8 to 10 styles can sit alongside 5,000 styles from other luxury designers, all of a sudden it makes a very different experience for the customer. And so what we realized was that in like the expansion of inclusivity and the body positivity movement, all these brands had dabbled in plus, which was really valuable. Like I can tell you, having been somebody who shopped in larger sizes for a long time, being able to wear the same brands as my friends is really important. Actually being able to get access to those brands was still very difficult. And so the pivot became very clear when we realized that all of a sudden there were all these fragmented subscale assortments out there, that if we could bring them together, it could create a type of experience for our customer that hadn't existed before and actually give her access to the brands that she'd wanted for a long time, but still was having a hard time accessing in a way that made a big difference. And interestingly, like I feel like in marketplaces always one side tends to outpace the other in terms of like, you know, is it a supply driven marketplace or a demand driven marketplace? We thought it was going to be harder to get brands to come on board than it was to get customers to come on board. And the value prop was actually most clear to brands. And our supply scaled dramatically more quickly than our demand scaled. Because brands were in this interesting position where they felt a lot of social pressure to be inclusive, but they just couldn't figure out how to make the business work themselves. And so instead of having to figure out how to make these like micro assortments work within their own platforms, most of the brands who are on our marketplace don't even have this product anywhere else on the internet because they don't want to have to figure out how to make it a positive experience on their own site. It's just available at Dia. So
Richie,
Great. Yeah.
go for it. Go for it.
Yeah, no, I have another question. With the HBS experience, I know Jennifer Hyman, who was a host at our show, founder of Rent the Runway, much earlier, probably 5 years prior to your starting your company. How was that network helpful in that journey? And did you get to speak to Jennifer or any other alumni? Because it's incredible alumni doing really cool stuff. And I guess as part of that question, also you mentioned the first million. I imagine it was raised also through kind of that HBS type of seed. Was that the first million? Two questions in there.
Yeah. So, I mean, the HBS network of female founders is actually pretty incredible. And I think that that's helpful from the perspective of having this community of women. But I think very practically, it's helpful because especially at the early stage, VCs are very sensitive to pattern recognition. And the fact that there had been these female founders that had, come out of HBS before us, at that time, these were all very successful businesses too, right? So you had Birchbox, you had Rent the Runway, you had Stitch Fix, you had, some in the fintech space. They weren't all consumer, but this idea that there are these like very credible, successful female founders leaving HBS in the years before us was very helpful because, VCs were like, oh, this is another set of female founders from HBS. I've seen this picture before. And VCs, whether they realize it or not, are, especially at the early stage when there's not much else to go off of, I think that they are very influenced by pattern.
For the first time, it helped. It worked in your favor.
It worked in our favor. I think that that's like an important theme, right? Because I think that the reality is that that's the same thing as saying representation, right? Like the more there are of these situations, the easier it is for other people to recognize them. And then the more there are, right? And it's this very, virtuous cycle of progress that I think we are the beneficiaries of. So that's on the HBS network. The first million was not from the HBS network. The first million was, the last, or one of the last benefits of being an investment banker was that I had a lot of, partners at the firm that I worked at that fortunately
bonus time.
Were very excited to support what I was doing next. And so the vast majority of that million came from the partners that I worked at Pro.
You get a tractor bonus with all your investment banker friends. It's like this is January, it's February. Yeah. Let's call it right now.
It was very, it was very generous of them.
That's great.
Well, I'm curious when you mentioned, Nadia, about that you were surprised in the marketplace to have the supply side understand the value prop a lot faster and quicker than the demand side. What are some things, having built this marketplace, what are some things along the way in your journey of building a marketplace that you wish someone could have shared with you? And I'm guessing, are those things, they evolve, or are there fundamental lessons that you're like, no matter when you start one, these are the things you got to keep in mind?
Yeah. I mean, we're still like very much in the middle of this because our, marketplaces are live organisms basically, and you have to continue feeding both sides. But I think that, figuring out like how both sides of your flywheel are connected, and therefore like how you can get one to move faster in a way that eventually gets the other one to follow is really important. And I think one of the things that was very helpful to us, what somebody told us early, is like, try to figure out ways where you can increase one side of your marketplace in a step function format versus linearly, right? So like,
okay,
if
is there an example? What do you mean by that? If you can.
So we just talked about, yesterday I was at HBS judging the new venture competition, and we were like talking about this exact thing. Somebody
oh, great.
Marketplace. And the question was like, is there something that you can go from having 100 apartments listed on your platform to having 10,000 apartments listed on your platform, even before you have customers, just to get to the next step function on the supply side, so your demand side can elevate? And in that case, it was like scraping Craigslist or like something like that, right? Where like you get some way of like massively increasing one side of the marketplace and then being able to let the other side catch up in these step functions, right? I've talked to a lot of marketplace operators over the years, and I think that most marketplaces that are successful have these kind of like step function changes that happen either on the supply side or on the demand side. Time that ends up unlocking growth for them in a way that simple linear growth, I think, can just make hard. And, you know, for us, one of the ways that we unlocked like step function changes in supply was actually through M&A. So, you know, like the asset,
that's great.
asset pricing market and consumer businesses has been very depressed for a long time. And we realized that, you know, if there were other companies that had aggregated a portion of the supply that we were looking at, it may actually make sense to acquire the entire company to get that step function change to our marketplace.
There's the investment banking once again helping.
Investment banking in a global recession, that means that assets are trading at like, you know, very, very, very low prices.
Yeah.
That's basically how we added luxury to our marketplace. So we acquired a company called 11 Honore that had been really the only player in Plus that was doing luxury, and they like true luxury, like Dolce & Gabbana, you know, Oscar de la Renta, like real luxury, which is very, very hard supply actually to aggregate. And we acquired them in 2022, and it just like, it was a huge accelerator to supply, not just interestingly because there was a lot of luxury supply that came on the platform, but because once luxury supply was on the platform, every other brand wanted to be there. Because luxury has this like super powerful halo that like everybody loves to hang out with luxury brands.
Yeah, it's sexy.
Everybody, like Madewell, like any brand that you can think of, are like, oh, you know, Oscar de la Renta and Alcazar are here, we'll come. And it was just this like huge accelerator to the supply side, which happened in this like step function leap that I think is beneficial. Because if you're just like going like brand by brand by brand, you can get there, but it can take a long time. And there's like, time is kind of the,
and you have competition, I'm guessing, right? You're also, depending on how slow you are, how fast others are, can eat away at your market.
Kind of weird world where there's like not that much competition. It's like, it's more like you have to be able to keep the customer's attention more so than like beat out other retailers. Like, but it just like, it was this like step function change that then all of a sudden, like all these other, like there was the supply that literally came from the acquisition. Then there was this like next wave of supply that came because of the acquisition. And that was like really like a, you know,
Nadia, was this the first, sorry to interrupt you there. I was just going to ask you, was this the first time that you went forward with an acquisition? And in terms of the process, was it any lessons from that? Was it longer than what you'd hope for? That, you know, are there things that you're like, okay, next time we acquire a company, we got to make sure that we have the following set up correctly, like the following, you know, ducks in a line or whatever. Anything that you could share about that?
So it was the second acquisition that we'd done. The other acquisition was very different though. It was we acquired a company called the CurvyCon, which was a consumer property in the plus size world, like a consumer media and event property. It was like, I don't know if anyone online is like familiar with like Comic-Con or BeautyCon or like any of those. But there was a similar property started by influencers called the CurvyCon, which was like the largest plus size event property. We acquired that in 2017. Unfortunately, that did not age well through the pandemic. Large scale in-person events really kind of took a hit.
Right.
But it was good from the perspective of just like learning the you know, the deal making motions, which I think are important. I think that the reality of acquisitions is that I think people get very focused on the deal and on the deal process, but by far the hardest part and like where success is created or not is in the integration and actually figuring out how to operate with a new portion of the business with new team members. And I honestly think that it is way more challenging than people realize, regardless of the size of the acquisition. Because
So the hard part starts after the acquisition.
hard part starts after. Like, you have teams that have different cultures, you have teams that are used to different ways of operating. You know, there's like an inevitable amount of friction in terms of saying, well, like, this is how we set goals. This is like what our OKR process looks like. Here's how everything needs to be translated from the way that you guys were doing things into the way that we were doing things. You know, how resources end up being distributed across more, there really is like, it probably took us a full year to get to the place where the 11 on array business, even though it was like, from like a deal size perspective, it wasn't a big deal, but it was like operationally a lot of work to integrate that business.
How big was the team that you had to integrate with?
I think that at the time of the acquisition, there was probably like 20 people that came from 11 on array. A lot of those people left. Like, there's like a lot of like friction, you know, kind of like culture adjustments and all kinds of stuff. So I think that people really underestimate the soft sides of an acquisition.
Sorry, the 20 was the first one, or the 20 employees, or which one was the 11 was the second one? Which was the second acquisition?
The company's name is 11 on array.
Yeah.
And they had about 20 employees.
Oh, okay, that was the one with 20. Okay, the most recent one. Mm-hmm.
So I think integration is really the challenging part with, but you know, I think that like in any of these situations, if the strategic rationale is clear, some things can go wrong, they can still make sense. Like for us, even though there was a lot of work to figure out like how to integrate the business, the supply came on immediately. Right. And so like the marketplace was going, the supply was there. And then there was like all like the organizational and the people, you know, work to kind of figure out, which was actually like a lot of work for our people managers. But the supply came on immediately. And so like we were able to see the strategic benefits, even as we worked through like the organizational complexity of really integrating, you know, a new team.
And Nadia, did you feel like you had to, when now you have this new team coming in, and you all have to figure out how to work together seamlessly, were you thinking about bringing in more people from like HR to help with something like this? And I'm curious, I always love asking, what was your first hire? You went through 2 years of bootstrapping and all that, and even though through that 1 million, but also the second question is kind of like, who was your first hire, and when did you decide to actually bring in, or do you have like an HR person?
I mean, at the very, very beginning, the first thing that we needed was a technical co-founder.
Was a what co-founder? I'm sorry, I missed that.
A technical co-founder.
Technical. Yeah, there was a question here about product and tech for teams.
So Dave, who was our founding CTO, joined us very, very early. And still a Dia. So, you know,
that's great.
True partner. The architect of basically every piece of tech we've built, the leader of our engineering teams. So really kind of foundational was the idea that like we were building a technology company, and even though we had, you know, a lot of perspectives on the business and the customer and the product, we needed real technical partnership. So most of our early hires were all engineering hires.
Wow, interesting.
Lydia and I could do basically everything else.
And what about sales? Was there, you know, when did you decide to bring in someone else to help, whether it was for partnerships, like more brands, or whether it's on the other side?
That actually came like fairly late, because so much of the early growth was organic, and it's not because I don't think that that's possible today. I think that that's just because like Instagram was so young that the type of virality that you could get on an organic basis on Instagram is kind of like what people are looking for on TikTok today, but it's not quite happening in the same way. Like Instagram, early days of Instagram was this like magical thing where organic content got a lot of visibility and it was very commercial. Like people actually bought things off of Instagram very early. On TikTok today, you can get a ton of engagement, but I have very, very, very rarely seen across any company that I know of where that engagement leads to revenue, right? Like the commerce component of TikTok, I think, is still very nascent. And like the magical thing about Instagram and Facebook before that was that for whatever reason, people were very comfortable making purchases immediately off of Facebook or Instagram in a way that doesn't seem to have translated into TikTok. So like in those days, like the amount of traffic, organic traffic and revenue that we were getting from Facebook and Instagram was like, you know, mythical. Like no company can do that now because there's just like no organic reach on any of those platforms anymore.
Yeah.
But because we had that at the beginning, we didn't really do that much. Like we were much more product oriented and, you know, kind of like operationally oriented in terms of like how to keep up with the demand. And it really wasn't until we raised like more substantial money that we were starting to deploy more money into marketing that we started building out those teams.
And how many employees do you have now, Nadia, more or less?
On the corporate side, we have about 65.
Okay, excellent. So as the CEOs tackle the toughest problem, pretty much any problem that the team sends up, and does a lot of course correction. Alejandro and I, we're 2 out of 3 brothers. We're all tech founders for the past decade in different tech startups. And the third brother, I was just catching up with him maybe a couple of days ago. And he happens to tell me that, share a story that somebody, a leader in his sales team, he overheard a leader in his sales team mention something about like, oh, this huge potential customer that they were trying to close, it didn't look like it was going to happen because the person had an interesting way of communicating and this and that. It was a tough cookie. And so Andres happened to overhear that, and he said, well, if it's going to be a 0, let me jump at it and let me give it a try. And he jumped at it and, you know, and signed up this really, really big customer. And that's a scenario where he happened to get to that. He happened to overhear the conversation. Has there been a time where you received, you know, some critical information just in time to course correct? Something that comes to mind, like an interesting one?
And as you think about that, that very much ties with like communication of
as the team grows.
Yeah, it's like the team grows. How do you keep that? But to Richie's point, has there been things like that have occurred?
Like,
oh my God, thank God, and like now we should do this or we should do that.
Yeah, I mean, I can't think of an example like, or at least a good one like off the top of my head, but I think that one of the things that's always been true about Dia, honestly, for better or for worse, is that we have very, very open communication. This used to be in person because we're fully remote now, but we used to be all in the same office in New York. And we were an organization that had like bi-weekly anonymous AMAs and like all kinds of stuff. So like we were hearing constantly, like I feel like I would sit in some of these conversations sometimes and founders would say like, you know, I really want to be able to get more feedback from our team. And I'm like, I get nothing but feedback from our team.
That's all I get.
Every piece of feedback you can imagine, we hear it. Like there was just like very, very open. And now it's the same on Slack, right? So like,
I wanna ask one last thing here, and then bring it for anyone that wants to ask Nadia a question. So think about that. In the meantime, AI, large language models, like any impact within your world, your space, marketplace, anything that excites you, where this could take what you're up to and what you're doing in terms of the future or near future?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, the business that we scaled for the first 6 years of Dia was a very machine learning heavy business. It was a recommendation based styling service that was very similar to Stitch Fix, right? And like that was the model that we had. And at the peak of our data science efforts, we probably had 60 machine learning engineers at Dia working on recommendation engines across the business. That's something that wouldn't happen today, right? Like we were building all kinds of models that today we would never invest in ourselves.
Right.
That the interesting thing that's happened now is that 2 points on this. One, I think the much more interesting thing is having accumulated large bodies of data within any specific domain. And for us, I think the amount of data that we've aggregated, honestly, primarily because we were a styling business, which was just this like massive high signal data collection engine, gives us like these kind of unique opportunities to leverage the amount of like training data that we have with, you know, off the shelf models in a very interesting way. So one is just like the importance of actually accumulating data that can be interesting in a way that allows you to apply it to your own domain in ways that other people may not be able to do. I think outside of that, the pace at which third-party providers are developing AI solutions across the continuum of the customer experience in e-commerce, as is the case in every industry, is like spectacular, right? So we can add AI everywhere from, for the first time ever, for example, and this is contentious, but I actually think that it's very good for our category. The quality of AI generated photography, for example, in a fashion context has dramatically improved. And one of the biggest obstacles that most brands have to making plus size clothing is the cost of creative, right? It is so expensive for brands to photograph products on multiple models. It's really like astronomically expensive. And the reality is they don't have to do it anymore. We have a partner that we work with on photography that if we give them a photo of the product on a size 0 model, they can create a beautiful, realistic, I promise you to your eyes, you would never know that
That's
it's
amazing.
not a real model in a size 16 or 18. And that, like the amount that unlocks in terms of, especially in, like for us, we have tens of thousands of styles on the site, things that can systematically improve the content of our PDPs or the amount of information or the quality of information or content that we can produce for any specific SKU, which has to be able to happen at scale, is super valuable. And I think a lot of these, you know, folks that are working on like these very specific verticals or portions of commerce with AI applications have been very, very interesting. SEO, I think, is dramatically going to change. Like the amount of high quality content that we can generate on our site now for SEO purposes is just dramatically different. You know, anything related to product content, I think, has been transformed. But those are not things that are worth us doing ourselves. Like there's so many vendors. I probably get outreach from 15 new AI providers in commerce a week now. Like everyone's doing something, and a lot of them are very valuable. So
that's awesome. Any questions from the group here? Anyone have a particular question? You want to feel free to raise your hand. If not, I have a couple. I have
Vijay, right? Vijay, did I pronounce your name right? You had
Ajit. I saw Ajit raise his hand.
Oh yeah, there we go. Yeah, whichever you want.
Hey Vijay, you want to go first, or you okay with me going first?
We're a very polite community. I love this.
I'll go first. So hi Ajit, CEO, co-founder of Craved. I had a question about the step changes, Nadia, right? So how do you know when the step change is happening, and what are the growth loops that you talked about? I think that's what would be interesting to know.
And Ajit, what do you do? Just a little quick intro.
So it's a marketplace where we connect you to home chefs who come to your house, cook for you, and clean up. Best part, you don't have to do groceries as well. So that's basically what we do. Yeah.
cool. I think that the approach that we've taken is how do we make the step change happen versus like when do we know that it's happening? So like, is there a partnership or a angle or something, you know, in your case, for example, that could, instead of you acquiring chefs a couple hundred at a time, like, is there a culinary school that could add 1,000 chefs next week, right? Like, are there ways that you can figure out like where there may be existing networks of the type of supply or demand that you're looking for that you could tap into, either collaboratively or in some cases by scraping or like other things, like, there's a lot of scrappy ways of doing things. But for us, like the idea was, is there anything that we were adding like 1,000 styles a week, right? And it was like, is there anything that could add 15,000 styles with one move? And that's like where the idea for the acquisition came from. Like, it was like, is there anything that we can kind of tap into that would dramatically accelerate one side of this? And then I think it's like a matter of like figuring out, like, theoretically, that the growth loops exist in a way where, if supply improves, then you have more liquidity in your marketplace, demand should improve, but that's kind of like a very vague connection. Like, in reality, what are those touch points that actually connect supply and demand? So like for us, a big one is SEO, right? Like with every 10,000 styles that we add, the number of pages, the amount of content, like our ability to rank against any search term increases. And so like that becomes like a growth loop that we look at much more closely. Like, okay, like how many more terms are we ranking on the first page now because we have this much more? And that's like one of the things that's been very helpful with the AI stuff too, right? Because even across our tens of thousands of pages, how do we improve the content of all those pages so that we're ranking even more too? And so like figuring out like what is the connection more tactically between why supply should improve demand, I think it's something that you can like figure out with time and then become that much more focused on saying, okay, we've added this step function change in supply. We need to make sure that all these pipes are connected in a way where it can translate into demand, and then demand increases, and then you go back and do supply again. Like, I've not really seen marketplaces that kind of just go like one for one, like a little bit more supply, a little bit more demand, a little bit more supply, a little bit more demand. It like tends to be that these things happen like in like jolts.
Right.
That at least from the conversations that I've had with other marketplace operators and from what I've seen from our experience.
That's really helpful, Nadia. Thank you so much.
Of course.
Excellent. And DJ, do you have that? Do you want to introduce yourself and ask a question?
I don't know if he might be, but he did text. I think he either froze but the question was, are you solving the supply or the demand problem? So I think it was related, might have jumped in a little bit later from our conversation, something that Nadia had mentioned.
I guess he's probably asking right now in this moment, like which one is that a thing? Which one is? Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would say in our case, we really are a two-sided marketplace where both supply and demand have challenges. And so, at the end of the day, everybody's end consumer in our marketplace is customers. And so we always think about customers first, but brands have a real challenge to solve too, right? Brands want growth. Brands want to be able to see the market potential of their brands in larger sizes actually come to fruition. Brands have a social imperative to be more inclusive. Brands, there are a lot of things that brands are also trying to do that we can help with. But I do think that it's important in marketplaces to know like who is the ultimate customer. And for us, the ultimate customer is the end customer. So everything that we're doing should be in service of the end customer, but we are solving problems for both sides. And that's the only way that it really works, right? Like it has to be that there's a reason why your supply side needs to be with you and not doing it on their own for you to be able to aggregate enough supply to be interesting for demand. And that's, I think, the nature of the chicken and egg.
Awesome. Well, Nadia, I want to thank you so much for your time and for sharing your journey and all these insights with us. I want to thank everyone that joined us here as well. And I look forward to being able to share a number of insights from the conversation with our communities. Anything you want to add to that, Richie? Your mute is on.
I said no. Thank you very much, Nadia.
Thank you, guys. It was great to be with you.
Likewise.
Bye, everyone. Good luck with your businesses.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.